Imagine the most charming person you know. I want you to picture the person who always says the right thing at the exact right time with uncanny, almost surgical precision. This is the person who seems to decode you, reading your insecurities, your desires, better than you can see yourself. You feel safe. You feel seen. Now I want you to reframe that image. Imagine that this emotional intelligence isn't born of compassion, but of calculation. Imagine empathy used not as a bridge to connect, but as a knife to dissect. What if the person crying with you at the funeral is simultaneously harvesting your vulnerabilities for later use? We tend to think of empathy as inherently good, a virtuous trait that defines humanity. But like any tool, in the wrong hands, it becomes psychological weaponry. All right, baby. Welcome back to Planting Thoughts. I'm Mike, and today we aren't just planting some of those seeds of thought, we are excavating the roots of human identity. We are stepping away from the standard neurosis and into the clinical, the complex world of personality disorders. We're going to dissect the narcissist, the borderline, the dependent, and the antisocial. But we're also going to shine a light, a new, terrifying construct that researchers are only now just beginning to understand. A personality type that turns kindness into a trap. The dark empath. So, before we diagnose our neighbors, we need to understand exactly what a personality disorder really is. Right? What are we actually looking at here? According to the DSM-5-TR, which is basically the Bible of psychiatric disorders, right? Psychiatric diagnosis. Having a personality disorder is not just having a difficult personality or being a jerk. It is a rigid pattern, right? An enduring pattern of inner experiences and behavior that deviate markedly from the expectations of the world and, more personally, that individual's culture, possibly even their family. Now, to be clinically significant, these patterns actually have to be pervasive and inflexible, right? They're not willing to change and they're all consuming. They aren't a mood, in other words. They are an actual climate, right? Right. What's the difference between climate and weather? Well, this is a good example. The biopsychosocial model, which is basically a combination of multiple psychological models, suggests that these disorders arise from a double hit, a loaded gun, if you will, of biology pulled by the trigger of the environment. Biological factors. We often see dysregulation in the prefrontal cortex, right? The CEO of the brain, responsible for impulse control, executive decisions, things like this. You also have this thing called the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. You have environmental factors, things like chronic childhood trauma, invalidating environments, right? Where emotions are pushed away, hidden, or conversely, right? Environments where excessive indulgence without boundaries was present, right? You also have this thing we'll call the egosyntonic problem. It's unlike anxiety, right? Where you have a problem. People with personality disorders often view their behavior as natural. This is just who they've always been. They think you're the problem, to be honest. I mean, imagine your emotional wiring was installed incorrectly, right? The alarm system goes off when it shouldn't, or the brakes on your impulse, they just don't work at all. It makes life and specifically relationships incredibly difficult. And it doesn't change just because you want it to. Now, the DSM, right? That Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders that we talked about a minute ago, it groups these disorders really into two distinct clusters. And today we're going to focus on cluster B. And this is kind of like the dramatic or emotional or even erratic group of personality disordered peoples. Now, these disorders are the ones that cause chaos, right? Interpersonal chaos, the ones that fuel the plots of our favorite movies and our worst nightmares. Think the Joker, right? In The Dark Knight. All right. First, the one our culture is currently obsessed with: narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, people throw this word around really loosely, but clinical NPD is tragic. It's defined by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, right? Feeling a need for sort of admiration and a distinct lack of empathy. However, researchers like Elsa Roningstam have highlighted that there are actually two faces to this disorder. One, you have the grandiose narcissist, right? Grandiose narcissism, the arrogance, the thick skin, the outward aggression. But then you have vulnerable narcissism as well. And this is the shy narcissist, right? They're hypersensitive to criticism, prone to deep shame, and their grandiosity is a quiet fantasy they use to protect their fragile self-esteem. The danger here is the cycle, right? It almost always moves to idolization. You are the best thing that ever happened to them, right? And then it goes to devaluation. You are flawed and worthless. To discard. It's defense, right? It's a defense mechanism. If they can make you small, they feel big. And that is the dark genius of the narcissist. Two, you've got this guy called the borderline personality disorder, right? If NPD is a suit of armor, borderline personality disorder is having third-degree burns over 90% of your emotional body, my dudes. This disorder is characterized by frantic efforts, either real or imagined, right, to avoid abandonment, right? Unstable relationships. This is a disorder marked by extreme impulsivity. And the neuroscience here is compelling and kind of heartbreaking, to be honest. Functional MRI studies show that in BPD personalities, right, BPD patients, the amygdala can fire with significantly more intensity when presented with neutral facial expressions. They literally see threats and anger when absolutely none exist. Now, the reality is we have to credit this lady, Dr. Marcia Linehan, the creator of dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, for reframing this. BPD isn't inherently manipulative, right? It's really a desperate response to immense pain. Now, if you are going to experience this, it is emotional whiplash. The mood cycles rapidly, not over weeks, like bipolar disorder, but over hours, even in minutes sometimes. Then we've got the histrionic personality disorder, number 3, right? This is an often overlooked disorder, but the histrionic personality disorder, which they'd be really upset if they knew they were being overlooked, but the narcissist needs to be admired, right? The histrionic just needs to be seen. They don't care what kind of attention they're getting. They are uncomfortable when they are not the center of it. And it could be bad attention, good attention, neutral attention. It doesn't matter. Now, what are the key traits? Their emotions rapidly shift, and they're often really shallow people. They use physical appearance, seduction, erratic, sort of flirty, promiscuous behaviors to draw attention, right? They're performative. It's a performative identity. They feel like they only exist when they are being watched. Not quite as dangerous, probably, but it could be kind of a pain in the butt to be friends with someone with this. Lastly, we've got the Antisocial Personality Disorder person, APSD. Now, this is what the public often calls psychopathy or sociopathy, right? Though the DSM uses ASPD, and it's defined by things like a pervasive disregard for the rights of others, deceitfulness, lack of remorse, empathy, shallow affect, etc., right? I mean, neurologically, researchers like Kent Keel have used mobile MRI scanners in prisons to show something fascinating. Now, individuals high in psychopathic traits have reduced gray matter in the paralimbic system. Now, what does this mean? Well, the paralimbic system is responsible for processing emotion, right? And moral judgments. So, in plain English, the psychological breaks of fear, guilt, and anxiety, yeah, they don't show up with these dudes, right? They stop you from doing something terribly, simply not to engage for them, right? They don't even feel their stomach drop when they lie. They feel nothing. I mean, I've heard before that a psychopath cutting your throat would be the same as a psychopath eating a sandwich. It doesn't cause any kind of real emotional regulation or dysregulation. I want to make a quick vital stop in cluster C. We have what's called the anxious group. That's what cluster C is all about. And I want to talk about the dependent personality disorder, DPD. Now, while cluster B acts out, cluster C acts in, right? DPD, marked by excessive need to be taken care of, leading to almost like a submissive, kind of clingy behavior and a paralyzing fear of separation. Now, why do I mention this? Because the dependent and the narcissists often are magnetic to one another. The narcissist needs to be worshipped. The dependent needs someone to worship. This dynamic explains why so many people stay in abusive relationships, right? Their psychology feels safer in submission than in independence. I mean, I knew a woman who stayed with a clearly emotionally abusive guy, someone who just cut her down on a regular basis, was, at least somewhat violent, right? And yet this woman stayed with him regardless, because she was so fearful of just being alone and not having someone in her life that loved her. It was really sad. Now, to understand these disorders, we're going to have to look at how they manifest in the stories we tell, right? While we can't diagnose fictional characters or historical characters, right, we can infer traits that align with these disorders to help us recognize them in real life. Let's look at the narcissistic and Machiavellian archetype, right? Look at Amy Dunne from Gone Girl. She displays high narcissistic traits combined with that Machiavellian strategy, right? She performs versions of herself, right? The cool girl, depending on her audience. She just weaponizes vulnerability. I mean, this isn't being crazy. It is a high functioning, low empathy strategy to control her environment. This would go right along with those psychopathic traits. You've also got the antisocial archetype, right? Consider the Joker in The Dark Knight. I mean, he isn't just an agent of chaos. He displays high cognitive skills and empathy. He knows how to break people with zero effective empathy. He doesn't care. And then you have Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. This guy is the ultimate depiction of the remorseless hunter, right? Utterly void of social contract. He doesn't care. History is littered with these personalities, right? Napoleon Bonaparte displayed classic grandiosity, right? Narcissistic, need for admiration, legacy. The Roman Emperor Caligula exhibited cruelty and exploitation of antisocial traits. Even Mary Todd Lincoln, is often retrospectively analyzed by historians as having traits consistent with BPD. Intense mood swings, spending sprees, terrifying fears of abandonment. Now, lastly, I want to talk about a new personality. Something that's sort of at the forefront of personality research. A concept not yet really in the DSM, right? But one that is rapidly gaining traction because it explains a type of predator we previously couldn't categorize. And this is known as the dark empath. For years, psychology focused on the dark triad, right? Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The assumption that these dark traits correlated, right? And they always correlated with low empathy. If you were dark, right, you couldn't understand feelings. Groundbreaking study in 2021 by researchers at Nottingham Trent University turned this on its head. They identified a group of individuals who score really high on the dark traits, but also score super high on empathy. But here's the distinction. There's effective empathy, the ability to feel when another person is feeling. If you cry, I feel sad. But then there's this thing called cognitive empathy, the ability to intellectually understand what another person is feeling without completely feeling it yourself. Now, the dark empath is high in cognitive empathy, but low in affective empathy. Think about the danger of that combination, if you will, right? The psychopath doesn't care what you feel, right? Because they don't even understand it. The dark empath understands exactly what you feel. They can map your emotional landscape better than anyone, even you, right? They know precisely where your insecurities are buried because their cognitive ability and their empathy acts like an X-ray. They are the love bombers. They're incredibly supportive, right? Until they use your deepest secrets against you in a moment of calculated betrayal. Am I right? Now, the difference is they aren't the blunt instrument of the sociopath, right? They are the scalpel, cold precision. They derive their power not from intimidation, but from social manipulation. I mean, these people are just really good at getting exactly what they want, and they do it in a twisted, dark, manipulative way. Now, why do we need to know this? Because awareness is our only defense. You cannot communicate your way into making an antisocial person feel remorse. It's not going to happen. You cannot love a narcissist enough into having genuine empathy. You just can't. And you cannot outmaneuver a dark empath. They've already written your entire playbook. They know every tell, every insecurity, and they are waiting to use those things against you for their benefit. When relationships feel too perfect, or when someone seems to know you way too quickly, examine the mask. Are you interacting with a human soul or a sophisticated defense structure designed to harvest your trust? Might be number two. Here's my thought for you to plant this week. We all wear masks to survive socially, but sometimes the mask fuses to your face. And when you look at the people closest to you, ask yourself, do you know the person in front of you? Or are you simply loving a well-designed facade? Scrutinize charm that feels too thick. Question empathy that feels performative. All right. If this deep dive helped you see the strings, please subscribe to Planting Thoughts and leave a review. It helps more than you know. Until then, keep digging, keep thinking, and keep planting those thoughts, baby. I'll see you on the flip side. Later.